The dust-stained letter trembled in Margaret Andrews' hands as the verdict from the town council sealed her fate. Banishment from Fort Smith, Arkansas, a town where she'd lived all 19 years of her life. Her family stood on their porch, her mother weeping silently while her father's face remained hard as stone, unmoved by the tears streaming down his daughter's cheeks as she clutched her swollen belly. "Please," Margaret whispered, the May breeze of 1873 catching her words and carrying them across the yard. "Where am I to go?" Her father's voice cut through the evening air like a knife. "You've brought shame upon this family. No decent man will take you now, with another's child growing inside you. You're no longer welcome under this roof." The setting sun cast long shadows as Margaret gathered her few possessions. A change of clothes, her mother's silver hairbrush slipped secretly into her bag, and the meager savings she'd tucked away from her work at the general store. $53 to start a new life with a child on the way. Sheriff Thompson stood awkwardly at the gate, tasked with ensuring she left town limits before nightfall. "I'm sorry, Miss Andrews," he mumbled, avoiding her eyes. "Council's decision is final. Best get moving before dark." Margaret straightened her back despite the ache. "What of James? Has he nothing to say about his child?" The sheriff shuffled his feet. "Mr. Cooper left town 2 weeks past. Headed to California from what I heard. Said nothing about any child." The betrayal stung worse than the banishment. James Cooper had sworn his love, promised marriage, then vanished when she'd told him about the baby. And now the town that had raised her was casting her out, treating her as if she carried disease instead of new life. "The stagecoach leaves in 20 minutes, the sheriff added, offering his arm to help her with her bags. Margaret refused his assistance. "I'll manage on my own. I've been left no choice but to do so from now on." The stagecoach driver eyed her condition with open suspicion, but took her money nonetheless. As Fort Smith faded into the distance, Margaret pressed her forehead against the window, one hand resting protectively on her belly. "I'll find us a place," she whispered to her unborn child. "Somewhere we can belong." The journey west was punishing. Margaret changed stagecoaches 3 times, each driver more impatient than the last with her frequent requests to stop. Her money dwindled alarmingly fast. By the time she reached the small settlement of Cottonwood Springs, Colorado territory, she had only $12 remaining and a back that felt like it might snap in half. The coach lurched to a stop in front of a dusty building with "Hotel" painted in faded letters above the door. "End of the line for you, madam," the driver announced, tossing her bag into the dirt. "This is as far as your fare takes you." Margaret struggled down from the coach, her legs stiff and her ankles swollen. The settlement was little more than a wide spot in the trail, a hotel, a saloon, a general store, and a scatter of houses and small farms stretching into the distance. The mountains rose majestically in the distance, indifferent to her plight. She stood alone in the street, clutching her bag while the stagecoach rumbled away. A wave of dizziness swept over her, and she staggered toward the hotel's porch steps. "Careful there, madam." Strong hands caught her before she could fall, steadying her against the railing. Margaret looked up into the concerned face of a tall man with a weathered complexion and kind hazel eyes beneath the brim of a dusty cowboy hat. "Thank you," she managed, embarrassed by her weakness. "You look like you could use a seat and some water." His voice carried the drawl of the frontier, but with a gentleness that surprised her. "Name's Henry Ashford. I run the cattle operation north of town." "Margaret Andrews," she replied, accepting his help to the bench on the porch. "I'm just arriving. I can see that." His eyes took in her condition without judgment. "You have people here in Cottonwood Springs?" Margaret looked away. "No, I don't know anyone here." A silence fell between them, broken only by the distant piano notes drifting from the saloon. "Well, Miss Andrews," Henry said finally, "this town might not look like much, but it's got good people. Mrs. Wilkins at the hotel might have worked for you. She's always complaining about needing help with the cleaning and cooking." "I'm a hard worker," Margaret said quickly. "And I know my way around a kitchen," Henry nodded. "I don't doubt it. Let me speak with her." True to his word, Henry returned with a stern-faced older woman who scrutinized Margaret with narrowed eyes. "How far along are you?" Mrs. Wilkins asked bluntly. "Nearly 7 months," Margaret admitted. The woman sighed. "I need someone who can work, not someone about to birth a child." "I can work," Margaret insisted. "I've been on my feet all through this journey. I need the position, Mrs. Wilkins, please." Henry cleared his throat. "Sarah, she's come a long way. Give her a chance at least until the baby comes." Mrs. Wilkins' expression softened slightly. "I can offer room and board plus $2 a week. You'll help with breakfasts, laundry, and keeping the rooms in order. Once that baby comes, we'll have to reassess." It was far less than Margaret needed, but it was shelter and food. "Thank you, I accept." As Mrs. Wilkins went inside to prepare a room, Margaret turned to Henry. "Why are you helping me?" Henry shrugged, adjusting his hat. "Everyone deserves a chance, Miss Andrews. Besides, a woman in your condition shouldn't be alone in a strange town." He hesitated, then added, "If you need anything, my ranch is 3 miles north. Just follow the creek." Before she could thank him properly, he tipped his hat and strode toward his horse tethered outside the general store. Margaret watched him go, wondering at the unexpected kindness from a stranger when her own family had turned her away. The following weeks were a blur of exhausting work. Margaret rose before dawn to help prepare breakfasts for the hotel guests, spent mornings scrubbing floors and changing linens, and afternoons doing laundry until her hands were raw and red. Mrs. Wilkins wasn't unkind, but she was demanding, and Margaret's growing belly made the work increasingly difficult. Word spread quickly through the small community about the unwed mother to be working at the hotel. Some women from town crossed the street to avoid her, while others whispered behind their hands when she passed. The local preacher made a point of stopping by to inform her that Sunday services were open to all of God's children, even those who had strayed from his path. But there were kindnesses too. Dr. Miller, the town physician, checked on her condition without charging a fee. Mrs. Parker from the general store brought a basket of baby clothes she'd made when her own daughter was expecting. And every few days, Henry Ashford would appear at the hotel, ostensibly on business, but always finding a moment to ask after her health. "You look tired," he commented one afternoon in late July, finding her resting on the back porch during a rare break. "I'm fine," Margaret insisted, though her back ached fiercely. "Mrs. Wilkins has been understanding." Henry leaned against the railing. "Understanding isn't the same as accommodating. You need more rest." "What I need is to keep this position," Margaret countered. "The baby will be here soon enough." "And then what?" Henry asked quietly. The question had haunted Margaret's sleepless nights. "I'll manage somehow, I always do." Henry studied her for a long moment, then reached into his pocket. "I brought something for you." He handed her a small paper-wrapped package. Inside was a beautifully carved wooden rattle, polished smooth with intricate patterns etched into the handle. "Mr. Ashford, I couldn't possibly—" "Henry," he corrected. "And it's just a small thing. Made it myself during the evenings." "You made this?" Margaret ran her fingers over the detailed carvings. No one had ever created something so thoughtful for her. "It's pine," Henry explained, suddenly looking embarrassed. "Good, solid wood should last." Margaret felt tears threatening. "Thank you, truly." Their conversation was interrupted by Mrs. Wilkins calling for Margaret to help with dinner preparations. As she struggled to rise from her seat, Henry stepped forward, offering his hand. The brief contact sent an unexpected warmth through her fingers. "I should get back," he said, releasing her hand. "Got some new horses coming in tomorrow, but I'll check in on you soon, Miss Andrews." "Margaret," she replied softly. "Please call me Margaret." A smile crinkled the corners of his eyes. "Margaret it is, then." As August arrived, bringing sweltering heat that made the small attic room where Margaret slept nearly unbearable, her body began giving warning signs. Her ankles swelled so badly she could barely fit into her shoes. Sharp pains occasionally shot through her lower back, causing her to gasp and grab the nearest support. Dr. Miller, making one of his regular visits, frowned as he examined her. "The baby's positioned fine, but you're exhausting yourself. You need bed rest, Miss Andrews." Mrs. Wilkins, hovering in the doorway, cleared her throat. "I can't pay someone who can't work, doctor. I've been more than charitable as it is." "She needs rest," the doctor insisted. "Another week of this and we'll have a premature birth on our hands." The argument continued as Margaret sat helplessly on the examination table, one hand protectively covering her belly. She couldn't afford to lose her position, but neither could she risk her child's health. That evening, a knock came at her door. Mrs. Wilkins stood there, her expression conflicted. "Mr. Ashford came by earlier," she said. "He's offered you a position at his ranch, said he needs someone to cook for his men and keep the house until you've had the baby and recovered. He's willing to provide a cabin for you and the child." Margaret stared in disbelief. "He offered this today." Mrs. Wilkins nodded. "Said he'd come by tomorrow to discuss it with you, if you're amenable." Sleep eluded Margaret that night as she considered the offer. Henry had been kind to her, certainly, but moving to his ranch would put her entirely under his power. Men's kindness, as she'd learned from James Cooper, often came with expectations. Yet remaining at the hotel was becoming impossible. Henry arrived the next morning, hat in hand, as he stood in the hotel's small sitting room. "Mrs. Wilkins told me about your offer," Margaret began, studying his face for hidden motives. "It's a practical arrangement," Henry said. "I've got 6 ranch hands and no one to cook decent meals. The cabin's been empty since my foreman got married and built his own place last year." "And what would you expect in return?" Margaret asked directly. A flush crept up Henry's neck. "Just meals for the men and basic keeping of the main house. Nothing. Nothing improper, Miss Andrews. You'd have your privacy and independence." "People will talk," she warned. "They always do." "Let them," Henry shrugged. "I've never much cared for gossip." Margaret considered his open expression, the steady gaze that met hers without wavering. "Why are you really doing this, Henry?" He was quiet for a long moment, turning his hat in his hands. "My sister found herself in a similar situation some years back. The father vanished, and she had nowhere to turn. She died bringing my nephew into the world because she was too proud to ask for help, working herself to exhaustion until it was too late." His voice grew rough. "The boy was raised by strangers. I've always wondered if things might have been different if someone had offered her a helping hand." The raw honesty in his voice convinced her more than anything else could have. "When would you want me to start?" Relief crossed his features. "I can bring the wagon around tomorrow morning, if that suits you." And so the following day found Margaret seated beside Henry on the bench of his wagon, her few possessions stowed in the back as they made their way north along the creek. The landscape opened up before them, rolling grasslands dotted with wildflowers, the distant mountains a blue haze on the horizon. "It's beautiful," Margaret murmured, breathing in the clean air scented with sage and pine. "It's good country," Henry agreed. "Hard sometimes, but good." The Rocking A, as Henry's ranch was called, came into view as they crested a gentle rise. A large main house built of sturdy logs stood in the center, with a bunkhouse, barn, and various outbuildings arranged around it. Corrals held horses of different colors, and in the distance, cattle grazed on the summer green grass. "Home," Henry said simply, a note of pride in his voice. The small cabin that would be Margaret's new home sat 100 yards from the main house, close enough for convenience but allowing for privacy. It was basic but clean, with a bedroom, a small sitting area, and a functional kitchen. Someone had placed wildflowers in a jar on the table and stacked firewood neatly beside the stove. "I had the boys clean it up," Henry explained, watching her take in the space. "Mrs. Parker sent those curtains when I mentioned you were coming." Unexpected tears sprang to Margaret's eyes. After months of judgment and hardship, the simple kindnesses overwhelmed her. She turned away quickly, not wanting Henry to see her emotion. "It's perfect," she managed. "Thank you." Henry cleared his throat. "Well, I'll let you get settled. Dinner for the men is usually at 6, but take today to rest. You can start tomorrow." Life at the Rocking quickly fell into a comfortable rhythm. Margaret rose early to prepare breakfast for Henry and his ranch hands, 6 weather-beaten men who treated her with awkward courtesy, calling her Miss Margaret and removing their hats whenever she entered the room. She would spend mornings baking bread and preparing the midday meal, resting during the afternoon heat before starting dinner preparations. The work was still demanding, but Henry insisted she take breaks and often sent one of the younger ranch hands to carry water or firewood for her. As her due date approached, he reduced her responsibilities further, hiring a young woman from town to help with the heavier tasks. "You're paying Lizzie to do half my work," Margaret protested one evening as Henry lingered after dinner. "It doesn't make sense." "What doesn't make sense is risking your health," Henry countered, his tone allowing no argument. "Dr. Miller says you need to conserve your strength." Margaret sighed, sinking into the rocking chair Henry had brought from the main house. "I'm not used to being idle." "There's a difference between being idle and being sensible," he pointed out, taking a seat across from her. The evening light caught the golden highlights in his brown hair, and Margaret found herself noticing the strong line of his jaw, softened now by a half-smile. In these quiet moments, when the day's work was done and they could simply talk, Margaret discovered a man unlike any she had known. Henry spoke of his dreams for the ranch, of the books he read during the long winter evenings, of his travels before settling in Colorado. He listened with genuine interest to her own stories, never judging her past or the choices that had led her to Cottonwood Springs. "You ever regret it?" he asked one night. "Leaving Arkansas?" Margaret considered the question, one hand absently stroking her belly where the baby kicked steadily. "I didn't leave by choice," she reminded him. "But no, I don't regret it now. There was nothing left for me there." "And the father?" Henry's voice was carefully neutral. "James made his choice," Margaret said, the old pain dulled now to a distant ache. "He didn't want this child." "He didn't want me, not really, I see that now." Henry's expression darkened. "Some men don't deserve the name." "What of you?" Margaret asked, curious. "You've never married?" A shadow crossed his face. "Nearly did once. Elizabeth was her name, daughter of a rancher over in Utah Territory. We had it all planned out, but then her father lost his land in a bad investment. They moved back east to live with relatives." He shrugged. "She sent a letter 6 months later saying she'd met someone else, a banker's son." "I'm sorry," Margaret said softly. "Don't be. It was years ago." Henry's smile returned. "Things have a way of working out as they should." As August gave way to September, the first hints of autumn crispness touched the air. Margaret's time grew very near, and with it came increasing anxiety. Dr. Miller visited weekly now, assuring her that everything was progressing normally, but Margaret couldn't help but remember Henry's story about his sister. "You're stronger than you know," Henry told her one evening, finding her standing on the cabin's small porch, her face tight with worry. "And you're not alone." The simple statement, spoken with such certainty, eased something in Margaret's chest. She wasn't alone, not anymore. The labor began on a clear September morning as Margaret was kneading dough for the day's bread. The first pain took her by surprise, sharp enough that she gasped and gripped the edge of the table. When it passed, she washed the flour from her hands and walked carefully to the main house to inform Henry. He was in his study reviewing the ranch accounts, but he jumped to his feet the moment she entered. "Is it time?" Margaret nodded, another contraction building. "Would you send for Dr. Miller?" What followed was a blur of pain and waiting. Henry dispatched his fastest rider to town for the doctor, then personally escorted Margaret back to her cabin. Mrs. Parker arrived shortly after, having been alerted by one of the ranch hands, and took charge of the birthing preparations. "First babies often take their time," she reassured Margaret, helping her change into a clean nightgown. "We've plenty of hours yet." But the baby had other ideas. By mid-afternoon, Margaret's contractions were coming fast and hard, and there was still no sign of the doctor. "The creek's probably risen from yesterday's rain," Mrs. Parker said, trying to hide her concern. "He'll be delayed crossing it." Henry paced outside the cabin, his face growing increasingly worried as Margaret's cries intensified. Finally, he could stand it no longer and entered the cabin. "What can I do?" he asked Mrs. Parker, his voice tight with concern. "Pray," the older woman said grimly, "and fetch more hot water. This baby isn't waiting for Dr. Miller." The next hours were the most difficult of Margaret's life. The pain tore through her in waves that left her gasping and weak, sweat soaking her hair and nightgown. Mrs. Parker's calm instructions seemed to come from very far away as Margaret fought to bring her child into the world. "I can't," she sobbed after a particularly brutal contraction. "I can't do this." "You can." Henry's voice came suddenly from beside her bed. He had taken her hand, his grip strong and steady. "You're the strongest person I know, Margaret Andrews. You can do this." His presence gave her courage. With the next contraction, Margaret bore down with all her might, a scream tearing from her throat as she felt the baby finally, blessedly, slip free of her body. A moment of terrible silence, and then a lusty, indignant cry filled the small cabin. "A boy, Mrs. Parker announced, tears in her eyes as she quickly cleaned and wrapped the infant. "A beautiful, healthy boy." Margaret wept as the tiny bundle was placed in her arms. Her son had a shock of dark hair and a perfect, red face that screwed up in protest at the brightness of the world. 10 fingers, 10 toes, and lungs that worked impressively well. "He's perfect," she whispered, looking up to find Henry watching them with an expression of wonder. "He is," Henry agreed, his voice thick with emotion. "Just like his mother, Doctor." Miller arrived an hour later, apologetic and worried, only to find mother and baby resting comfortably. He examined both carefully, pronounced them healthy, and instructed Margaret to remain in bed for at least 3 days. "You were lucky," he told her privately. "Childbirth without proper medical attention is dangerous. You should thank Mrs. Parker and Mr. Ashford. He was apparently quite the assistant." Margaret smiled, watching Henry through the doorway as he paced the porch with her son cradled awkwardly but tenderly in his arms. "I will." She named the baby Samuel Thomas Andrews Samuel for her grandfather, and Thomas for Mrs. Parker's late husband, who had helped arrange her position at the ranch. The ranch hands treated the new arrival like royalty, bringing small handmade gifts and asking sheepishly if they might hold him. Henry was a constant presence during those first weeks, checking on Margaret and Samuel several times daily, bringing books to read aloud during the long afternoons, sitting on the porch with them in the evenings as autumn painted the landscape in golds and reds. "He looks like you," Henry observed one sunset as Samuel slept peacefully in Margaret's arms. "Poor child," she laughed softly. "No," Henry said seriously. "He's fortunate. He has your strength." Margaret felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the shawl wrapped around her shoulders. "Thank you for everything you've done for us, Henry. I don't know how I'll ever repay you." "There's nothing to repay," he said simply. "Having you both here has brought life to this place." He hesitated, then added, "I hope you'll stay even after you've fully recovered." "Where else would we go?" Margaret asked. Henry's expression grew serious. "You could go anywhere, build any life you choose. You're not trapped here, Margaret. I want you to know that." The fact that he would say it, that he wanted her to stay but would understand if she chose to leave, made Margaret's decision all the easier. This is where we belong now. As autumn deepened toward winter, the dynamics between them shifted subtly. Margaret resumed her duties cooking for the ranch. But now, with Samuel, either sleeping in a cradle, Henry had built for the kitchen or wrapped securely against her chest. Henry began taking his evening meals at her cabin rather than the main house, often lingering afterward to help with dishes or simply talk as the baby slept. The ranch hands exchanged knowing looks but said nothing, treating the arrangement as perfectly natural. The townspeople were less charitable, particularly when Margaret began attending Sunday services at the small church in Cottonwood Springs, Henry at her side carrying Samuel as if the child were his own. "The nerve of that woman," Margaret overheard Mrs. Thompson whisper to another churchgoer. "Flaunting her situation and now entrapping poor Mr. Ashford." The words stung, but before Margaret could react, Henry's hand was at her elbow, guiding her firmly past the whisperers. "Pay them no mind," he murmured. "They'll find something new to gossip about by next week." "They think I'm trying to trap you into marriage," Margaret said later that afternoon as they sat on the porch, watching the first snowflakes of the season drift lazily from the gray sky. Henry looked genuinely amused. "Is that what they think? It's not funny, Henry." "Your reputation, my reputation is exactly as I want it to be," he interrupted. "The opinion of gossips means nothing to me." Margaret sighed, adjusting Samuel as he fussed against her shoulder. "Perhaps I should find a position elsewhere." "You've done more than enough, and I don't want to bring you trouble." Henry was quiet for so long that Margaret thought he might be considering her suggestion. When he finally spoke, his voice was hesitant, unlike his usual confident tone. "I've been meaning to talk to you about something, actually." He stood, moving to the porch railing, his back to her. "These past months, having you and Samuel here, it's shown me what I've been missing." Margaret's heart quickened. "Henry," he turned to face her, and the emotion in his eyes took her breath away. "I know it hasn't been long. I know you've been through more than anyone should have to endure, and I would understand completely if you need more time or if your answer is no, but I find myself hoping." He crossed the porch in 2 strides and knelt before her chair, taking her free hand in both of his. "Margaret Andrews, I love you. I love this boy as if he were my own. I don't want you to stay as my cook or because you have nowhere else to go. I want you to stay as my wife if you'll have me." Margaret stared at him, tears filling her eyes as Samuel squirmed between them, oblivious to the moment that would determine his future. "People will say you only married me out of pity," she whispered. "Let them say what they will," Henry replied firmly. "We'll know the truth." "And what is the truth?" Henry Ashford. His hands tightened on hers. "The truth is that you belong here with me. Both of you do. The truth is that I never expected to find love again, certainly not with a stubborn, beautiful woman who arrived in town ready to take on the world single-handedly." His voice grew husky. The truth is that I can't imagine this ranch, this life, without you in it. Margaret touched his face, her fingers tracing the lines etched by sun and wind and laughter. This man who had offered shelter without conditions, who had held her hand through the darkest hours of childbirth, who looked at her son with love rather than judgment. "Yes," she whispered, leaning forward to press her forehead against his. "Yes, I will marry you, Henry." His kiss was gentle at first, a question more than a demand, but when she responded with all the emotion she'd held carefully in check for months, he gathered her and Samuel into his arms, holding them as if they were the most precious things in the world. "We'll make a good life," he promised. "The three of us." They married on Christmas Eve in the parlor of the main house, with Samuel cradled in Mrs. Parker's arms and the ranch hands standing awkwardly in their Sunday best as witnesses. The circuit preacher, visiting Cottonwood Springs for the holiday, performed the ceremony, making no mention of Margaret's unconventional situation. "You may kiss your bride," he pronounced, and Henry did so with an enthusiasm that made the ranch hands whoop and stamp their feet. Later, as a light snow fell outside and Samuel slept peacefully in the cradle moved to the master bedroom, Margaret stood before the fireplace in her wedding nightgown, watching her husband stoke the flames. "Are you happy?" Henry asked, straightening to look at her with such tenderness that it nearly brought tears to her eyes again. "More than I ever thought possible," she answered truthfully. "When I was forced to leave Fort Smith, I thought my life was over. I never imagined I would find this." Henry crossed to her, taking her hands in his. "That town's loss was my gain." He kissed her knuckles gently. "Our gain. Samuel will grow up knowing nothing but love here." Margaret leaned into his embrace, feeling the steady beat of his heart against her cheek. "I love you, Henry Ashford." "And I love you, Margaret Ashford," he whispered against her hair. The winter passed in a blur of domestic happiness. Margaret moved into the main house with Henry, transforming the previously bachelor residence into a proper home. Samuel thrived, growing plump and strong, his laughter filling the rooms that had once echoed with emptiness. Spring brought new calves, the roundup, and the busy work of a prospering ranch. Margaret worked alongside Henry, learning the business aspects of ranching while managing the household and caring for Samuel. The ranch hands, initially awkward around the baby, became fiercely protective uncles, bringing him treats from town and carving simple wooden toys during their free time. By summer, rumors reached them that a railroad spur line might be extended to Cottonwood Springs, bringing new possibilities for expanding the ranch's operations. Henry spent long evenings at the kitchen table, calculating figures and planning for the future while Margaret worked on accounts beside him. "We could double the herd if we had reliable transportation to the Denver markets," Henry mused one night. "Maybe bring in some of those Hereford cattle they're talking about." "We should consider hiring more hands," Margaret suggested. "Tom and Bert can't manage additional cattle on their own." Henry looked up from his papers, a smile spreading across his face. "Listen to you. We should consider." "You've become quite the rancher's wife." Margaret smiled, reaching across to take his hand. "Is that a complaint, Mr. Ashford?" "Quite the contrary, Mrs. Ashford." He squeezed her fingers. "I couldn't ask for a better partner." When Samuel took his first steps in July, tottering uncertainly across the kitchen floor before collapsing into Henry's waiting arms, Margaret felt her heart might burst with happiness. The memory of her banishment from Fort Smith seemed like a story that had happened to someone else, a necessary trial that had led her to where she truly belonged. In August, as Samuel's first birthday approached, Margaret discovered she was expecting again. She told Henry on a warm evening as they sat on the porch swing, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains purple and gold. "Another baby." Henry's face lit with wonder as he placed a gentle hand on her still flat stomach. "Samuel will have a brother or sister. Are you pleased?" Margaret asked, though his expression left little doubt. Henry gathered her into his arms, mindful of Samuel sleeping against her shoulder. "I'm beyond pleased. I'm the luckiest man in Colorado territory." The baby was born the following spring, a daughter they named Elizabeth Rose, with Henry's hazel eyes and Margaret's determined spirit. Samuel, now a sturdy toddler with his mother's dark curls and a vocabulary that grew daily, approached his sister's cradle with solemn curiosity. "Baby," he pronounced carefully, patting her blanket-wrapped form with gentle fingers under his parents' watchful eyes. "That's right," Henry affirmed, lifting his son to get a better view. "This is your sister, Elizabeth. You're her big brother now." "You'll protect her," Margaret added, watching her children with a heart so full it ached. "Just like your papa protects us." As Elizabeth grew alongside her brother, the rocking prospered. The railroad did indeed come to Cottonwood Springs, transforming the once sleepy settlement into a bustling town. Henry's foresight in expanding their operation paid dividends, allowing them to build a larger, more comfortable home while maintaining the cozy charm Margaret had come to love. 3 years after Elizabeth's birth, another son joined their family, William Henry Ashford, born during a summer thunderstorm that the ranch hands claimed was an auspicious sign for a boy destined to be as strong as his father. By the time Samuel was 7, he was riding his own pony and helping with small chores around the ranch. Elizabeth, at 4, was a whirlwind of energy and questions, while little William toddled after his siblings with determined persistence. "Did you ever imagine this?" Henry asked one evening as they watched their children chase fireflies in the gathering dusk. "When you first came to Cottonwood Springs," Margaret leaned against his shoulder, his arm warm and secure around her waist. "Never. I hoped only for shelter and the chance to raise Samuel safely. This." She gestured to the thriving ranch, their beautiful home, the children laughing in the twilight. "This is beyond anything I could have dreamed." Henry pressed a kiss to her temple. "You know, I think about that day, sometimes the day you arrived. How close you came to not getting off that stagecoach here, how our lives might never have intersected." "I believe we were meant to find each other," Margaret said softly. "All the pain, the shame, the banishment, it was the path that led me to you." In the autumn of 1883, 10 years after Margaret had first stepped down from the stagecoach in Cottonwood Springs, a letter arrived bearing an Arkansas postmark. Margaret recognized her mother's handwriting immediately, though she hadn't seen it in a decade. With trembling fingers, she broke the seal and read the carefully penned words. "My dearest Margaret, I pray this letter finds you well. It has taken years for me to discover your whereabouts, as your father forbade any inquiry after you left. He passed on last winter, and in his final days, he expressed regret for his harshness toward you. I have learned through distant acquaintances that you have made a life in Colorado, that you are married to a respected rancher, and that my grandson Samuel is thriving. I cannot express the joy this news has brought me, nor the sorrow I feel for the years we have lost. If you can find it in your heart to forgive an old woman's weakness in not standing against your father's decision, I would dearly love to meet my grandchildren and the man who has been a true father to Samuel. Your loving mother, Henry Andrews." Margaret sat on the porch steps, the letter clutched in her hand, tears streaming down her face. Henry found her there, and without a word, he sat beside her, reading the letter when she handed it to him. "Will you write back?" he asked gently. Margaret nodded, watching Samuel and Elizabeth teaching William how to roll a hoop across the yard. "She deserves to know her grandchildren, and they deserve to know her. We could invite her to visit," Henry suggested, Or we could travel to Fort Smith next spring after the calving season." Margaret turned to look at him, this man who had changed her life with a simple act of kindness all those years ago. "You would do that? Return to the town that cast me out?" Henry's expression was resolute. "I would walk into that town proudly, with my beautiful wife on my arm and our children beside us. Let them see what their judgment nearly destroyed this family, our happiness." Mrs. Henry Andrews arrived in Cottonwood Springs the following April, a small, nervous woman whose face crumpled with emotion when Samuel, now 10 years old, stepped forward to greet his grandmother. "He has your eyes," she whispered to Margaret as they embraced for the first time in a decade. "Oh, my dear girl, what a fine young man you've raised." The visit stretched from the planned 2 weeks into a month, and then the entire summer. Henry Andrews blossomed in the presence of her grandchildren, reading them stories, teaching Margaret family recipes, and even, to everyone's surprise, learning to ride a gentle mare Henry provided for her. "You've created something beautiful here," she told Margaret one evening as they sat shelling peas on the porch. "I am so proud of you." "I didn't do it alone," Margaret replied, watching Henry in the distance, teaching Samuel how to mend a fence. Henry followed her gaze. "He's a good man, your Henry." "The best," Margaret agreed. When it came time for Henry to return to Arkansas, the decision had already been made. She would sell the house in Fort Smith and return to the Rockingham permanently, moving into the guest cottage that Henry's men were already expanding for her comfort. "Are you certain?" Margaret asked her mother. "Fort Smith has been your home your entire life." Henry's smile was peaceful. "Home is where your heart resides, Margaret. Mine is here now, with you and these precious children." As Margaret watched her mother board the stagecoach for the journey back to Arkansas, a temporary departure to settle her affairs, she felt Henry's hand slip into hers. "Full circle," he murmured. "From a stagecoach arrival to a stagecoach departure." Margaret nodded, leaning against his solid presence. "When I arrived here, I was lost, afraid, carrying a child whose father had abandoned us both. I never imagined I would find not only shelter but love." Henry turned her to face him, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "Do you remember what I told you that day when I asked you to marry me?" Margaret smiled, the memory still vivid after all these years. "You knelt down and said I belonged here with you." "I meant it then and I mean it now," Henry said, his voice rough with emotion. "You belong here, Margaret Ashford. You and our children, and now your mother too. This is where you were always meant to be." As the stagecoach disappeared down the road toward town, Margaret looked around at the ranch that had become her kingdom, at the children playing in the yard, at the life she had built from the ashes of banishment and shame. "Yes," she said softly, her heart full to bursting. "This is exactly where I belong." In the years that followed, as Samuel grew into a fine young man who eventually took over much of the ranch management, as Elizabeth blossomed into a strong-willed young woman who defied convention by attending college in Denver, as William revealed a gift for veterinary medicine that would serve the ranch well, Margaret often thought of that dusty day in 1873 when she had stepped down from the stagecoach, alone and afraid. The banishment that had seemed a cruel punishment had been, in truth, the beginning of her real life. The shame that had driven her from her hometown had led her to true love, to a family bound not by judgment but by acceptance, to a place where she and her children could thrive without the shadow of condemnation. On their 30th wedding anniversary, as Henry and Margaret stood arm in arm watching their grandchildren play in the same yard where their children had once chased fireflies, Henry pressed a kiss to her gray-streaked hair. "Any regrets, Mrs. Ashford?" he asked, his voice still strong though lines of age now marked his beloved face. Margaret looked up at him, at the man who had knelt before her all those years ago and claimed her when the world had cast her aside. "Not one," she answered truthfully. "Every step of the journey brought me here to you, to this life we've built together. How could I regret any of it?" As the sun set over the mountains that had witnessed their love story unfold, painting the sky in the same brilliant colors that had welcomed Margaret to Colorado territory all those decades ago, she knew with absolute certainty that she had found what every human heart seeks: not merely a place to exist, but a place to belong.